Hello, everyone. Hello, hello. Thank you so much for joining this session, What's in Store, Inclusion, Equity, and Diversity for the Retail Innovation Week 2021 breakout session. Hopefully you were able to join the conversation earlier, and this is a good continuation from that. So again, as a form of introduction, I am Ezinne Okoro. I'm currently the Global Chief Inclusion, Equity, and Diversity Officer. I know it's a mouthful, but we will embrace the title for a global advertising technology communications agency called Wunderman Thompson, and it is part of the WPP family. So really what I wanted to do, and I must also remind you, I do have my my partner who's on my team, Lizette. She is in the room as well, and she will be helping guide the conversation, particularly within the chat. So we want to make sure we utilize the chat feature for any of your questions, comments. Give me some encouragement. Let me know if you like what I'm saying. If you don't like it, make sure you call me out on it as well. We are all here to learn together. So just a little background about me. I am originally from Nigeria. I was born there in Lagos. I am from Igbo descent, and I came to the United States at the age of 7. And I did all of my education, all my schooling, and all those things here, but I go back and forth to Nigeria all the time. So by nationality, I'm Nigerian, but I am also American. So when I think about what some of my passions are, I really think, so my background is actually in accounting and business strategy. So I have a little bit of the finance leg, have a lot of international business as well. And then I have this people aspect of it. I think one thing that is probably a bit interesting is I've never actually been in an HR team. So I don't consider myself to be an HR expert, but I do understand the fundamentals of business change management, business transformation, organizational design as well, that can aid a lot to maybe a lot of the HR functions. But with my passion and my expertise, I'm in the mix of between business strategy and people. So I combine those passions, the competencies, and my influence for change, specifically when we're talking about diversity, inclusion, and equity. And then a fun fact about me, so a lot of us are sheltering in place due to the global health pandemic of COVID-19. So I spent a lot of time watching TV and probably eating too much food. But one of the shows that I watch that I think it's absolutely amazing is the last show that I watched is called Your Honor. And it's on Showtime. And it's about a judge that is navigating through a situation that his son put him through because his son was involved in a hit and run accident. So if anyone's looking for anything to watch, go there. Trust me, it's amazing. You'll be glued and you will be standing on your seat. So feel free to drop in the chat, maybe something that you've learned specifically from Retail Innovation Week, or maybe it's a great show that you watched recently, or a great book that you've read while we have been at home for these last couple of months. So I'm going to go ahead and get right into it. So when we're talking about what's in store for diversity, inclusion, and equity, and I think in the conversation that we had earlier with Scott, really what I was telling everyone is, in my mind, there is no best practice, right? We want this to really be from the heart, authentic, genuine, sustainable change that will empower your workforce and for your company to be better and do better. We've all started to notice how much there's such a larger intersection work, personal, and what's happening in the world. And they're directly impacting the way that we operate and the way that we show up. So it's really important that we have a sense of really what's happening and how that continues to feed into the work that we're doing. So we've been talking about inclusion, equity, and diversity for decades. I know some people think like it's a new phenomenon that just happened last year and last summer. but it's not. We've been talking about it for a really long time, but really the question is, what is truly going to shift the needle this time around? What is going to make it be sustainable? What is going to make it feel like it's not just a buzzword? What are we truly going to be doing differently? And when someone asks me that, to me, what my response is that it's really about equity. And that's kind of why I wanted to visually kind of show the difference between diversity, inclusion, and equity here. We need all three, right? But the equity piece of it, I think, is one of the ones that we don't talk about often, and really thinking about is access and opportunity universal for every single person in your organization. When we take away gender, ethnicity, sexual orientation, class, age, do we all still have the same fundamental rights and opportunities regardless of how we identify? And I think the more we explore this equity piece, the more that we realize that that is truly what keeps the work sustainable. So as you're going through this and we're thinking about what's in store and what does inclusion, equity, and diversity look like long term, or look like 6 months from now, it's the equity piece. You're gonna hire diverse talent because they're out there, they're applying, you're reaching out, you're gonna get them. You're gonna create programming for people to have a sense of belonging. But are you going to have policies, procedures, and processes in place to make sure that it is sustainable and that everyone has the opportunity for it? So when kind of thinking about how I wanted to frame out this breakout session, is really wanted to kind of talk about how this shows up in your work. So again, I mentioned, and I think a lot of us witnessed what happened in the Capitol, and I don't want to get too much into that, but I want people to understand how acts that are outside what we can control impacts the way that we react and the way that we show up. So how does inclusion, equity, and diversity show up in our work that we're doing? And again, I'm representing an agency, so kind of keep that in mind when we go through that. The second thing is your customer connections. I think we have a lot of insights from Gen Z that I wanted to share because, they are the future. And I think a lot of things that are happening specifically in this space is because of Gen Z and young millennials pushing and kind of challenging what the norm was to no longer be the norm. And then lastly, I will provide you with some of my steps towards purposeful inclusion and things that I consider to be super critical when we're thinking about what does this look like in real life and in my work. So what I wanted to kind of do, because again, I don't want this to just be all about me talking. I want you to have visual representation of some of the things that I thought really resonated to me or were well received by my peers or the industry. And one of the works that we're going to highlight is this campaign called This Is My Color. And so This Is My Color is a campaign between Avon, Wunderman, Thompson, and another creative group called ID, and talking about beauty, and particularly in Latin America and Brazil. And if anyone has any historical context in there, there's a lot of colorism that happens specifically in Brazil and in the Latin America area. So Avon really wanted to make sure that, one, it was producing products that resonate to multiple people, and then two, how they were going to be represented in their ads, and then et cetera. So they came out with this campaign, which I think is super awesome, and I'll let you listen to it, and then I'll come back and tell you a little bit more of the background from it. So of course, this is technology, so I'm going to stop sharing this screen, and then I'm going to go to the actual video. So let's hope everything works out well.
Ser mulher negra, nascer com a missão, seguir com a segurança e a convicção de que o mundo é nosso e somos a revolução.
Para pra me ver como eu sou, para notar que eu também tô no mundo pra brilhar. Minha pele traz a minha essência, cada qual com a sua vivência, todas têm o seu lugar. Eu digo eu sou preta em bom tom, eu digo eu sou negra e é bom. Eu digo eu sou preta em bom tom,
bater no peito e dizer com vontade: eu sou preta, eu sou negra, essa é minha cor.
Okay. So, I think, tell me how you feel about what you watched there. But I think when we were watching it and when I first got a glimpse of that, I thought it was really phenomenal because really what it was doing was promoting beauty, right? And breaking the stereotypes of what maybe mainstream media maybe consider in as what beauty looks like. So I think it was a great representation of the diversity just even amongst the same color of Black, right? And I think sometimes we don't think about what that intersectionality looks like. And we see that the people that are represented who also came from different ages, different hair textures, different complexions. So I think it's one of the things that was really powerful. And another thing too is the song actually picked up a lot of enthusiasm, and you saw young girls like 4 or 5 years old singing that and embracing their identity. So I think it's really important that when we think about the work and how we're showing up for our customers and our clients, that we see the representation there too. So I'm going to go back and share my screen again, because there's another part that I want to show you. So I think one of the things too that's really important to remember is that as much as we have the representation in front of the cameras, we also want to make sure that we have the representation behind the cameras and who's working on it. So here's a bit of the data that the team was able to share as to their representation of people that worked on the campaign that are from that have Afro descent. And I think if you joined the session earlier, I think we were talking about companies that were going out and making statements of support to certain policies, organizations, platforms, et cetera. The most iconic one from last year was obviously Black Lives Matter. And some of the companies actually got a little bit of backlash about that because their employees did not believe that this is truly something that they stood for and thought that they were just doing it because everyone else was, right? So that's why it's really important that as much as we are promoting diversity on the external perspective, really take inventory as to what's happening inside of your organizations. And as I mentioned in the session, because your employees are your ambassadors, they are your champions, they are your first clients, they are your customers. So they have to believe in the work that you're doing and in your commitments and in your progress in order for it to be real. Because just really in the day and in the stage that we're in social media, people will call you out. Excuse me. People will call you out for that, right? And no one wants to be in the bad part of the news. Everyone wants to know, like, wow, we did this amazing thing to stand up and say, yes, we stand with you in solidarity. And, the last thing that you want is someone to say, oh, no, I don't believe you, and here are all the reasons why. So I think really make sure that we look at, one, how are you socializing some of your ideas and your work internally and before you put it out externally? And then how do you get them to be part of that process for you? So I think we were really proud to see that the representation was here so that we know that we are walking the walk and talking the talk at the same time. The other example that I wanted to show, it's also too by Avon, and that was completely ironic. It was funny when we were going through this. We were like, oh, they're both from Avon. But, I guess kudos to Avon for being committed to making sure that they are providing sound work going forward. But the other campaign that they did is called Mantra, and it's Power Stay. And this was based off of their... They have a makeup foundation that they were doing. And what they were saying basically is that it's made for people, women, I guess, that sweat. I think sometimes if you wear makeup, you are like, okay, I want this makeup to stay intact. I don't want it to run or anything like that. But how do you do that when you're continuing to be athletic and you are active, right? So it's the power stay. And I think it's also breaking the social norms about women athletes and what they represent and how and their progress. So stay tuned. Let me play that video for you. Definitely make sure you continue to engage on the chat about your opinions on some of the information that I am sharing. Okay, so again, this is from Avon, Power Stay.
A base fica, o medo sai. O suor sai, a base fica. A cor fica, a força fica. A dor sai, a resistência fica. A base fica, o suor sai, o medo sai, a história fica. A base fica, a cor fica. A dor sai, a luta fica. O suor sai, o suor sai, o suor sai, a base fica. Linha V. Stay.
Okay, I almost want like a round of applause after the video, but I guess I'll applaud myself and the team. But, you know, I think in looking at that video as well, I think when I look back at it, it tackles so many things, right? So I think one of the things that we talk about is the fact that it is addressing what it means to be an athlete, right? And what it means to be strong and what beauty means into that space. And then also too, we have representation from the disability community as well too, to make sure that they are represented when we're thinking about power and strength, and not only associated with like empathy and sad stories, right? So it's really important that we break what some of those norms are and we don't continue to box people into certain categories. And then, you know, I think just from a consumer perspective, you know, that's great. If you're, to me, you know, if I wear makeup. So if you're telling me that you're testing on someone that is an athlete that is out there, that's probably completely more active than I am, and their foundation stays, I'm sold, right? So I think that it's such a win-win for them. And I'll love to share with you also too, how we had some representation behind the cameras as well for those that participated in Mantra. So here, we're really focusing on the representation of women that are participating in there too. I think if we think about, you know, you want to make sure that you have the proper representation of gender balance when you're doing a campaign such as this. So really kudos to the team, and both campaigns have been so well received and received numerous awards as well too, just for their involvement in that advocacy work. So I think that that's how you continue to kind of see what does that mean for my organization. And if you're in a product perspective, think about how are you solving for, or how you're addressing some of the social conversation that's currently happening in the world. Okay, so now that we have that, you know, it's like, where do we go from here? What does it look like within your organizations, et cetera? And one of the things that I wanted to highlight was some of the data that we received from Gen Z. So we did a consumer data survey with Wunderman, Thompson Intelligence, and then eventually Wunderman Thompson Data, and surveyed people ages 16 to 24 to understand some of their patterns and some of their things that they have in their mind. And it was part of a conversation that we had in a internal event, it's produced internally, called Transform. And Transform was a day full of just amazing speakers and content producers talking about things from AI to Gen Z to sustainability, diversity, inclusion, et cetera. And Lizette is going to drop a link into the chat too, to kind of tell, in case anyone wants to explore more. But when I was looking at the data, I thought this was really interesting too, especially for this group, as we're talking about retail innovation, is the power of Gen Z. And I think that the actual section was called, let me just pull it, get it. The Kids Are All Right, How Gen Z Will Drive Recovery. So like I mentioned, if you go back and you think about when you're hearing about sustainability, when you're hearing about diversity and inclusion, when you hear about social justice and you think about who's on those front lines, it's Gen Z. Gen Z is fearless, they're bold, they're unapologetic. So how does that impact your work and what you're trying to produce and what you're trying to achieve? And I think it's really critical. So just in looking at some of the data here, it's really saying that 79% of Gen Z want their money to go to brands that they believe in. So this is where, again, I'm talking about that internal communication and external communication. What are you doing to show some of your progress? And from the companies that I worked at before, a lot of them are global. Some of them have headquarters in Europe. And a lot of times it's just culturally not, I don't want to say normal, for lack of a better word, to kind of talk about the impact that you're making. So when you're doing a donation or you're doing a partnership, we oftentimes don't want to speak about it. But if Gen Z is saying that 79% of them want to go to a brand that they believe in, we have to find that balance of being able to share what some of the work is, without being overly boastful. But I think this is the opportunity for you to share and say, I stand for this, we are partnering with this, here's what some of our initiatives are. A lot of them, 76% want to feel proud of the brand that they buy in. 76% want a brand that is accepting of a range of identities and experiences. I think this is super critical as we're talking about gaining and retaining talent. If you look at the data, I think it's about 45% of young professionals and have already in their mind that they will leave their organization between 3 and 5 years in order to start their own business. And a part of that is because of the lack of acceptance of their identities and experiences, right? The world is shifting. So we have to kind of make sure that we think about how are we shifting with that world as well too. 72% want a brand that cares about issues that are important to them. So again, kind of going back to the social justice and understanding as a leader, how do you respond to something that is happening at the Capitol? What are you supposed to do? We don't have anything to do with that directly, but indirectly, how are we supporting certain elected officials? How are we holding the government accountable? What are we doing from a lobbying perspective? So it's really important that we understand what are some of the issues, specifically from a Gen Z, and then 2, what are we doing to address them and to support them in there? And then lastly, 60% agree that their choice in the brand is an expression of who they are. So it's that big sense of belonging. And remember when I started this conversation, I was focusing on equity, right? Because that's exactly what it is. It's you can bring in diverse perspective and identities into your organization, but if there's no free and welcoming space to express or to know that you are in a judgment-free zone, you would quickly lose them. And it's the same patterns that we're learning from a consumer perspective as well. So I don't know if Lizette did already, but like I mentioned, she'll be able to drop some information in the chat regarding some of the additional data that we have with Transform. I think it's really great to listen to. Here's just some of the quotes that we've gotten from them. And I'm quoting from Naila, who's age 26. What does your C-suite look like? Are you hiring Black and brown people outside of diversity and inclusion positions? It's important. We're not just D&I tokens. And, and when I first read this, I remember someone was like, oh my God, are you offended by this? And I'm like, not at all, because I think that this is an important thing to state. I think having a diversity and inclusion leader is super important, and data does show that the majority of them are from African descent of some sorts. But I think what's really important here is that we open up our eyes and broaden our what we consider talent, right? And how we're engaging people. So if you're in the retail industry and you have a new role that's open, are you only looking for people that are also in the retail industry? Or are you looking at people that were consultants, or looking at people that were in banking, looking at people that were in startups, that were entrepreneurs that may be looking to get back into the workplace? I think those are the important things that I do not, unfortunately, see a lot of companies doing. We're not thinking outside the box. All we're doing is going to a competitor and trying to gain that talent back into our fold, when really we should be thinking, how can I get someone that is in a completely different industry that may be more innovative than we are, in order to bring that talent and that skill set in-house for us to be able to advance? So I think it's really important that we think about, what does that look like? And as far as the tokenism part of it, I think it's important that any person that you have in any role, especially the senior roles, and if they're the only, is how are you supporting them, and how are you ensuring that they feel a space of inclusion, and they know that they are truly a part of the conversation and the strategy, and not only being used in the midst of a crisis when you have to make a public statement. The other quote comes from Charlie 16. Have the youth voice on your team so the message is legit. And it's what the brand means, because people on their team are representing the issues they're talking about. I love this, because sometimes I don't remember what these quotes are, but it really validates everything that I mentioned, in the sense of not only the youth voice, but just make sure all the voices on your team represent the things that you're standing for. You can't possibly stand for, well, I don't want to say you can't possibly, but if you're thinking about how you're supporting from an inclusive design perspective, and disability and accessibility, I think it's really important that you make sure that you speak to people that are in those communities, so that you can make sure that you are doing it right. And there's no such thing as perfection, but you want to make sure that you're getting the information directly from the source, instead of being in the room with a majority identity that completely falls short as to what these experiences are. And like I said, Charlie will be an ambassador for something that he or she believes in order to be able to stand up and say, this message from this company is truly legit. Okay. So then, before we'll go into questions in a bit, but just to think about kind of wrapping up a little bit. So what is it that we can do now? I think one of the important things to think about is, what are some of the resources that are out there now? And they are tons. There are tons of things, depending on where you are in your journey, what some of your goals are, what do you have in store, and what are you trying to achieve? I think one of the biggest things, like I mentioned, is I think a lot of companies are, especially in the agency side, are looking for creative talent, right? So where do you find the creative talent? How do you get them to buy into your agenda and to go? And there was one particular organization that we thought it would be worthwhile highlighting specifically here, and I'll show you their reel in a second. But it's Linked It Black. And really what it is asking for people to do is to give some of their media space to highlight works of other people, of those that are in the minority. And I think it was a really clever idea to challenge a lot of businesses to think, like, what are you doing with your media space? How are you making people aware that you have projects for them to fill? How are you sourcing in your supplier and your suppliers? And I know the supplier diversity comes up a lot too. So this is just one of many different resources that are out there. So I don't want to make it seem like this is the only one, but I think this is a great opportunity and a really innovative way to kind of think about how you can use your platform in order to provide visibility for someone else. And again, let me just pause here and I'll open up the other screen. In the meantime, Lizette, as I pull this up, is there any questions or comments you want to be able to dive in here? And I'm just going to pull this up in a second.
Yes, definitely. We've received one. The main challenge I meet is companies, production teams being open for diverse talents behind the camera and workplace. How is the best way to point it out, encourage, and make it happen?
Yeah, I think that that actually good segue, because I think that's part of what I'm talking about with like the link it black is I think it's putting those names out there. What I've noticed too is, especially in the creative industry, people go with who they know, right? Because I already know your work is good. I already know you can execute. You already know what some of our limitations are, right? So I don't have to go through the whole spill of, hey, you know, this may be delayed or we may have a quick turnaround time. So unfortunately, people go with who they know. So the important thing is, how do you socialize new names, talents to other people, right? So I think it's finding those sweet spots of, hey, let me bring someone in the room, or I have a suggestion or a recommendation that I can put forward. I think put them forward. You don't have to wait for someone to ask for that. I think as you're seeing the work, you can easily say, oh, you know what? I have exactly a person that I think that would be perfect for this opportunity. Here is their contact information. And I think too is, especially the creatives that I've been speaking to, they're definitely more open to the different talents that are out there, because specifically the client is also asking for it. The client wants to make sure that what they're producing is also culturally sound and that it is promoting diversity and inclusion. So I know, like, in a lot of the clients that we have, one of the like most of them have like a top 5 goals. Diversity and inclusion is in 93% of those goals. I mean, of these clients. So I think that we have the opportunity now, probably honestly more than we did before, in order to bring forth a name that what may not have been mentioned before or have been overlooked. And a lot of directories have also been produced as well too. There's also Black creatives. There is POCC, which is another organization that is collecting just all diverse backgrounds that are in the creative industry to be able to support. So let me just go into the video really quick. Hopefully it works this time. Okay. So I think one of the things why I wanted to specifically highlight that, because I think one of the things I really like is that they're saying redirect your space, your privilege, right? So I think that's part of the change that needs to happen, is the acknowledgement, right, that there is a disparity there, right, and there's a gap. And then I think the second thing is then say, okay, now what am I going to do with it if I am in the decision-making seat, the seat of power, the seat of influence, the seat of a privilege? What am I going to do to it? So how do you yield your space for someone else? So I think the example that they have listed there of putting someone's name directly in your bio to say, hey, check this person out. I think that kind of goes a long way in kind of following up to Aaron's question is about how do you welcome or recommend new talents or different creatives into the space. And that's definitely part of it. It's a long journey because of what the norms were. And I know that there's also always this whole thing about the quick deadlines and things like that. I know I always push back on my teams and the other executives that I work with is like, we can't use time as our means of not providing people opportunity. Like that's a very old and unexcusable response. So we can no longer use that. We need to be able to plan it ahead of time in order to be able to provide space for people to welcome them into projects.
And
okay.
I think
sure.
It actually leads into the next question that we received from Aaron Batts. Can you talk about managing up when it comes to pushing for internal shift in mindset within companies? How does a manager approach a CEO about what they want to see?
Yes, great question. You know, I think one of the biggest things is understanding who your audience is, right? I think we all have to remember that we all don't receive information the same. So it's how the manager that you're speaking with, how is the best way to communicate with them? And I think one of the biggest things that I always recommend is allow for the conversations. Also understand that you probably only have like 10, 15 minutes for initial conversation. And make sure you kind of get to what your ask is. What is your ask and what are you offering, right? I see this, my teams feel this way. I recommend that we do this. Here's how we can do it. Here's how I would like to support. What do you think about that? And I think that if we continue to follow up with that and hold them accountable, I think what I mentioned before is a lot of companies are committing to doing better and investing more in inclusion and diversity. Go right back to those commitments. I remember you mentioned a couple of months ago that you wanted to do better when it comes to inclusion and diversity. And I appreciate the statement that you made publicly on Black Lives Matter. Here's one of the ideas that I had, and here's why I think that it will work with this company in this particular time that we're in. And if it costs something, put it down as well. And here's what I'm estimating that the investment would be. I think if we continue to have those conversations and build, and then if you feel like you're not getting anywhere in that conversation, then bring in another ally, right? And maybe Lizette and I and everyone that I work with, we know we do this all the time. You start the conversation. If you give me the heads up, the next time I interact with that person, I'm going to say, oh, you know, Lizette brought up this idea that I really think that we should pay attention to and listen to. Do you recall her bringing that up? Oh yeah, I recall, blah, blah, blah. And then now you add to that story as well too. So there's definitely strength in numbers and strength in voices. I think the willingness of CEOs and those in the leadership team is there for the most part. I'm not in all companies. I just hear around from my peers, but I think for the most part, they are willing to listen because they want to do the right thing. So I think it's us also kind of stepping away from fear and being direct and having that conversation. And the more that you can drill in, I think the more that you're peeling those layers and you're getting them where they are. But I think it's really also important that you take inventory as to what's going on in the business. If the business is in the middle of bankruptcy or something like that, it's probably not the best time that you will go and try to bring up forth a new idea, because that's going to be their main focus. But I always lean back on going back to what they mentioned in their town halls, in their newsletters, and their public statements. Hey, I saw that we said this. Here's what I would like to see. Here's how I can help. Okay. You're welcome. And then I just wanted to give some what I consider to be some of like my top 5 things. If I can do nothing else, I need to make sure I do these things in order for us to continue to build on inclusion, equity, and diversity. And the number one thing is data. So a lot of times, like I mentioned, people send out statements or they're investing $100 million in something, but you don't really have the data to back up any of these things. So nothing measured, nothing gained. So I think it's really critical that you benchmark where you are today. What I keep going back to saying is take a moment to take inventory to where you are so you can understand the road that you need to go to. No one is asking for you to go there the fastest. No one's asking for you to be the best. Everyone is just asking that you take the leap and you start. And in order to do that, you have to start from somewhere. So it's really important that you collect data. Go, depending on if your company is local or global, definitely look into some of the legal regulations. I think primarily in the US and in the UK, you are allowed to collect information on a voluntary basis as far as personal identifiers when it comes to the protected classes like gender, ethnicity, sexual orientation, age, and I believe, and there may be some, I can't remember what religion is right now, but you can ask. So I think go partner with your legal teams and figure out where are we, and look at the HR systems that you may have, or look at the payroll systems and find out how you can assess that data. So you really have a sense of where you are. What we don't want to do is use our own bias in order to judge how someone identifies. Second thing you want to do is educate yourself. Knowledge is power. I think a lot of times, especially if I kind of go back to specifically May 25th, 2020, when the world was essentially rocked with a lot of racial injustices and with the murdering of George Floyd, I think a lot of allies and the majority is like, I want to help. I want to help. I didn't know this was going on. And I think it's really important, as much as I can be able to educate you and to coach you, you have to educate yourself. So that when you're coming to a conversation, really what you're coming with is questions based off of the knowledge, and you want to get clarity, as opposed to someone starting from ground zero and telling you the very basic of what you can find in textbooks and in history, right? So it's really important. And also too, you, especially as those of you that are maybe on the call that are leaders, you want to be able to speak to changes, but also recognize you're not going to be an expert in everything, right? You have your own identity that you may feel most comfortable with, but we can't forget the other identities and conversations there. So how do you lean on those other people when you're trying to engage and have conversation? The third thing is to be open and have a judgment-free zone. It's really important that we create spaces that are safe for sharing and receiving information. I always tell all the executives that I work with, no question is a dumb question. I'd rather you ask me than you misspeak in a public forum, right? Or you say something in a larger space that completely does not land well with people. I think it's really important, as things that are going on in society, that your team members are okay saying, I cannot come to work today. I just don't have it in me. And we have to be okay with just saying, okay, take the time you need, and making sure that it's free of judgment when we do that. And there is no retaliation, there is no penalty or anything like that. And you can easily able to identify who is abusing their rights and who truly just needs the space. So I think we need to continue to provide those means of communication and openness as we're growing our businesses. The fourth thing, and actually I think this is the last thing, I think there are only four things, is to invest in inclusion, equity, and diversity. The same way we would invest in marketing, the same way you invest in research and development, the same way you invest in communications, and real estate and in technology. It's the same exact way that we must invest in inclusion and diversity in order for it to be sustainable. And that comes in different forms, right? It can be hiring talent. It can be improving your data. It can be investing externally. It can be storytelling means. It can be awards. It can be, I didn't talk about pay equity a lot. It can be in the form of pay equity. You have to be willing to invest into the areas, if you go back to the very beginning, of where you have the biggest gaps, and invest in those places. The first thing to do is not to offer an outside organization X millions of dollars when you don't have an internal process, right? So I think it's really important that we also understand that change needs a financial investment to it, right? So I always say, show me the money. Let me know that it's real and that you really want this to be something that we believe in and that really starts to shift the culture. So hopefully these 4 things are really good takeaways as you kind of think about where do you go from here. Oh, there is 5 things. Look at that. And the 5th thing is drive the commitments. I think this goes without saying, like, it truly is a marathon. I mentioned this earlier in the previous session. It's not a race. It's not about I think Scott asked me, what are some of the best practices? And I don't really know if I like that word, best practices, because it's different. It's different by industry. It's different by the size of the organization, where the organization is located, how many people are there. But what you want to do is put your best foot forward and understanding that it is your responsibility to drive these commitments forward in order for you to retain your people and in order for you to be able to excel in your revenue. So it does definitely hit the bottom line. I think that case has been proven 100 times over. So we really want to make sure that this doesn't just become a moment in the past, and when we are all prepared and can convene safely in an office, that this doesn't just stop, right? So we really want to make sure that we keep it going. Okay, so I'm going to formally open more so for Q&A, but definitely want to thank everyone for joining thus far and your participation. I really hope that the conversation was fruitful and you were able to get a bit more information. I'm happy to connect offline as well too, as needed, and just kind of thinking about how I can continue to support in this space, because it's super critical, and your customers are counting on it, your employees are counting on it, and it's for the better side of history. So I'm gonna, any additional questions, Lizette, or anything that came up?
We did. We had the other one from Julian. Beyond hiring a more diverse group of talent, what are some effective ways to facilitate upward mobility and career growth for members of traditionally marginalized communities? There's more, but take that first part.
Yes. No, fantastic question. And I think that it's definitely beyond hiring. I think oftentimes I mention the hiring piece because if we go back to the data often shows that you may not have the representation already in-house, right? So hiring is always going to be a thing because you're always going to need talent. But what is super critical is also retention. Companies need to create programming and that sense of belonging and equity in order for people to stay. So that's really how we do it and how we advance that. So really is doing the succession planning, finding out who your top talents are. And another thing too that I always advise is introducing some of those talents to decision makers and senior leaders. Because what happens is, and we all know this, a lot of times you get a role that's open, people already start throwing out names. So how do you make sure that that name is part of that conversation so that you can go and talk to that person, see if they're interested, et cetera. So it's so important that we start to talk to each other more and really be able to identify talent. So thinking about a mentorship type of program, even a sponsorship program, because maybe some of your managers are honestly just not the best mentors, right? Maybe they don't have the time or whatever it may be. I think even talking to them about creating some type of sponsorship, like find 2 people that you can sponsor and you're essentially going to support them and put their name forwards and things. And it's not only putting their name forward when it comes to a role that's available, but it's putting their name forward when it comes to something like this. So a presentation. How do I bring someone else's voice into the room where they're able to engage and create a platform that maybe they would not have had before? So I think that that's an important thing to do too.
Perfect. And you actually had answered the second part of the question.
Oh, yep, exactly. Yep. So thinking about trainings. Yep. And I think too, if you also think about people that have more of the tenure in the company. So if I'm in a company 5, 6, 7 years, how are you continuing to invest in me to make sure that I'm getting the training and the additional development that I need? It doesn't mean that I need to go back to a formal education setting, but maybe I need a program. Maybe I need a leadership development thing. Maybe I need a speaker's course. So I think that that's very important that for us to do too, is to invest, which is why I said that investment is not just in hiring, right? That costs dollars to create a program or to sponsor your employee to come to a conference like this. This is all part of development and what is needed in order to be able to have opportunities for promotion. Just in general, I really want to thank everyone for joining this conversation and for allowing me to share with you. Hopefully that, like I mentioned, you have some information that was that can resonate to you and into the work that you're doing. And everyone stay safe, and we can have a great conversation next time and continue to look into what the Retail Innovation Week is doing. Also, I'm at Wunderman Thompson. If anyone is looking to find out more about our services and what we offer, I'm happy to connect you to the powers that be in the organization. And thank you so much. Everyone stay safe.